I'm a research fellow at the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne, and I'm broadcasting today from unceded Wurundjeri land of the Kulin people. I pay my respects to elders, past and present, and welcome any Indigenous participants today. Thank you for joining us at today's Asia Institute webinar on maintaining pluralism in authoritarian systems, lessons from Turkey and beyond. We're delighted today to be sharing research from two University of Melbourne experts, from Dr. Tezcan Gumush and from Ian McGilvray. They've had their research published recently in Melbourne Asia Review, and they'll be sharing it with us today. As well, we'll then hear reactions from two of our friends from across the city from Deakin University. We'll be hearing from Dr. Dara Conjurt and Dr. William Gourlay, giving some reactions to what they've heard. We'll then hear your reactions, and we're looking forward to a lot of question and answer. We have a question and answer button open right now. So as you're hearing, if there's anything that sparks your interest, anything you'd like to discuss more when we get to our discussion, please do put it as you think of it. So to kick us off, I'm now going to turn over to Associate Professor Matt Nelson, who's going to talk a little bit, give you an introduction to the work of the Asia Institute and the work of the Islam and Politics in Asia and the Middle East Research Cluster. Over to you, Matt.
Great, thanks, Melissa. And thank you everyone for joining us. As Melissa pointed out, my name is Matt Nelson, and here at the University of Melbourne, I'm the convener of the Asia Institute's Islam and Politics Cluster. Now, for those who might be unfamiliar with us, the Asia Institute is a leading center for the study of Asia, broadly defined, from Japan and China to West Asia, including the Middle East. Apart from Asian languages, we have a particular focus on contemporary social, cultural, and political affairs, including, of course, the politics of the Muslim world. And today, we'll be focusing on current trends in Turkey, a country often seen as straddling the border between Asia and the West. Now, in particular, Dr. Tez Gumush and Ian McGilvray will be examining, as Melissa said, the challenge of maintaining pluralism in authoritarian systems. So can diverse political perspectives and opposition voices survive in contexts framed by authoritarian leaders like Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan? And if so, how? This is, I think, a timely topic. I'm sure many of us are following contexts with very similar challenges. I focus on South Asia, and of late, the challenge of maintaining pluralism in increasingly authoritarian electoral contexts like Bangladesh or even India has received quite a lot of attention. The challenges in places like Pakistan or Afghanistan are, I think, pretty well known. But with Tez and Ian, this afternoon we'll be focusing on Turkey. And then after hearing from them, our discussants, Dr. William Gourlay and Dr. Dara Conjurt, will deepen our understanding of Turkey and other cases in the region to develop a comparative perspective. Now, throughout 2021, our Islam and Politics Cluster will be hosting a number of seminars, workshops, and public lectures just like this one. And we'll be focusing on at least 4 different themes, from the parameters of political Islam, for example, Islamist political parties, Islamic foreign policy, to what we're calling Muslim trends in Asia, keeping in mind that most of the world's Muslims actually live in South and Southeast Asia, not the Middle East. And we're also considering a series called Muslims on the Move, looking at the global mobility of Muslims, and then the translation of Islamic ideas and practices, including some of the tensions that often follow from new encounters in multicultural contexts. And then finally, the politics of diversity within the Muslim community. I hope you'll join us for some of these events. Most of our events are open to civil society and community members, journalists, business people, diplomats, and of course our neighbors right here in Melbourne. So if you'd like to attend, I hope we'll hear from you. Thank you for being here and joining us at the Asia Institute. And thank you, Melissa, for giving us a chance to introduce the series.
No, thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be taking some of this research to a wider audience. I mean, as Matt's just said, this is an exciting and interesting research agenda, and there's so much to share. So I'm going to now call on Kez and Ian. They're going to start to share their screens. I'll get everyone else to turn their cameras off so everyone can see the screens well. And they're going to show you some slides just to give you a quick outline of what they found in their research. Over to you.
No worries. Thanks, Melissa, and thank you, Matthew, for that wonderful intro. So I guess we are pressed for time. So what myself and Ian will talk about will be much more of a, I guess, a broader overview. I'm sure if we were to get into details, we probably can spend a couple of hours here. I guess this is, I guess, the outline of our short discussion or presentation. So I'll basically look at the background leading into, I guess, in the last few years of the Turkish political landscape. Ian will talk about this contentious politics and how it really applies to our, I guess, our research, or perhaps the best way to sort of understand opposition politics in Turkey at this point in time. And then I'll look at the formal avenues used, so the conventional politics, formal politics by the opposition party to resist authoritarian consolidation. And Ian will look at informal and also evolved sort of strategies that we can observe in the recent years with opposition politics. And then I guess if we've got time, I can sort of just very briefly outline what has been happening currently as well in today in Turkey. So the key argument we're going to really put forward is that, you know, these the regular lecture losses to the AKP since 2002 and the dominance of Erdogan and the AKP government, and with the very slow, I guess, slow or fast, I guess, depending on your perspective, of slide towards authoritarianism and its institutionalization. So formalization with the, I guess, change to a presidential system into 2017 referendum. It really pushed the opposition to reconsider their political relationships, I guess, between one another, and to open up new possibilities. So to look for ways to engage and resist this authoritarian form of politics. And what we'll, I guess, touch upon, just a few of these ways, new strategies and methods that they have used to survive, exist, I guess, contest, and also aims to alter the authoritarian structure as well in the last few years. So I don't want to get into too much of a background. I think this is when, you know, a lot of us observers of Middle Eastern politics, or I guess general international politics, know that, you know, Turkey has, under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, has formalized or transitioned into an authoritarian system and this was really much flagged in the 2017 referendum, where Turkey just over 51% of the population voted for an executive presidential system. But unfortunately, this new system handed President Erdogan unchecked powers, where the parliament, of course, continues, but all, I guess, what we would call in layman's terms is a toothless tiger in terms of legislative authority. So a lot of pundits and analysts have categorized Turkey as some form of authoritarian system. Now, you know, every analyst has their own sort of categorization that they've placed Turkey in. I think competitive authoritarianism is probably the most popular, but nonetheless, that's not the only sub-form of authoritarian system Turkey has been labeled as. So this is what the opposition is really existing under in these last few years, where it's been a complete transition, sort of system change into sort of what you call single man rule in Turkey. I think this quote that we've used in our article by Sinem Adar and Yektan Türkyılmaz from Open Democracy really emphasize, I think, encapsulates, I guess, the opposition's operating environment at this point in time. So where they say that the range of instruments and the number of channels available to influence regime change had shrunk dramatically. That is, constitutionally defined means of political transformation have become de facto obsolete. It's basically, you know, outlining that the way to engage or push for policy or legislation is small, if possible at this point in time to the political opposition. And I think I'll leave it up to Ian to sort of discuss why contentious politics is a framework that we applied to understand Turkish political landscape or looking through opposition politics.
Thanks very much, Tez, and thanks, Melissa and Matt, for hosting us today for this talk. So look, basically just a bit of a quick overview. When we look at the Turkish opposition, I don't want to get too much in kind of the current discourse and all this sort of stuff, but it's important to understand that when we're looking at Turkish opposition, most of the current discourse kind of sees oppositional parties, social movements, these kind of things within Turkey is viewed as facile, kind of sedentary and impotent actors in the way they engage with the regime. More often than not, opposition parties in the literature kind of see are kind of viewed as complicit in the kind of decline of democracy that we've seen in Turkey over the rule of the AKP. Or they either strengthen the regime towards its inevitable authoritarian end with complacency, with arcane adherence to dogmatic principles, and with a general lackluster appearance in elections. So the problem with this kind of discussion, and this is where we're kind of going with our article, and of course with our discussion today, is that, you know, these kind of discussions fail to give agency to the opposition. And like with all authoritarian regimes, oppositional movements have agency. A lot of the Turkish scholars at the moment kind of focus everything on the AKP and of course Recep Tayyip Erdogan, but really, you know, looking at the opposition can help us understand the complexities of Turkey's authoritarian system and how actually dynamic it is at the moment. We need to remember that authoritarianism isn't kind of a unitary system. It isn't ahistorical. It's not timeless. Turkey has gone through 70 years of, you know, a democratic party politics. You know, it's not always been perfect. It's gone through ebbs and flows with coups and, you know, controlling by certain parties throughout history. But, you know, fundamentally, there is that large history of democratic politics, which allows space for oppositional politics to work in, whether that's through political parties, through social movements with unions. There is that kind of space there within Turkish oppositional politics to engage with regime and engage with the state. But with what we've seen particularly is that in the post kind of July 15th coup attempt period, the AKP's push towards this consolidation of authoritarianism. But fundamentally, as we will point out in today's lecture, that the opposition isn't inert. It's not an inactive group. It actually is quite dynamic. It's mobile and it has evolved in a relational strategy and synergy with the changing regime that the AKP's tried to put in since over the last at least 10 years. So what we're looking at is, of course, and I'm not going to get too bogged down in the theory of all this, but we've took our imagination from Sidney Tarrow's and Charles Tilley's contentious politics. You know, contentious politics and collective political action, you know, is a way of understanding how actors make claims bearing on other actors' interests against mainly political regimes. And these kind of contentious politics bring things together like social life. They're part of contention, they're part of collective action, and they're part of politics. Now, mainly Tilley and Tarrow's work looks at kind of democratic politics as well as traditional authoritarian regimes. And we can obviously look at the Middle East under, let's say, Mubarak's Egypt or Ben Ali's Tunisia as examples of this ossified kind of authoritarianism, which contentious politics works from. But you know, what we see particularly is that Turkey doesn't fit into this model as other traditional Middle Eastern authoritarian regimes. As we kind of pointed out, there's that history of democratic politics. There's a history of labor unions, history of party politics and engagement by oppositional figures. So we can see that despite the authoritarian nature of the current AKP government attempts to consolidate hegemony, there is still apparent space for contestation and contentious engagement. And this comes in the form of kind of performative aspects. Well, as we'll go through today, we'll talk about obviously formal aspects in which political parties and opposition figures engage in. We'll be then looking, of course, into informal aspects. This is more the performative aspects that allow opposition the ability to seize political opportunity structures in this new executive regime. And, you know, these kind of contentious politics allows us to understand that there is actually an evolution in Turkish opposition strategies as time has gone on and the system and authoritarian system has been implemented. There's been space for them to actually evolve their strategies to contest and make claims against Erdogan's regime and, of course, in the political sphere. Over to you, Tez.
No worries. Thanks, Ian. So we'll look at, I guess, I'll jump across into the formal ways that this has been challenged, and we'll look at the 2018 presidential and parliamentary elections of 2018, and also we'll look at the municipal election 2019. Look at some of these strategies amongst the opposition, which is being seen is being key to I guess their success, even though it's been an extremely unlevel playing field and extremely authoritarian operating space. They've been able to still resist authoritarian consolidation. So, and really being able to gather, I guess, a very strong amount of votes, despite the disadvantages that they're forced to operate in. And we see this, I guess, a key marker of this is that was seized by the opposition when, in lead up to the 2018 elections, the AKP government pushed through legislation on March 3rd, which allowed permitted electoral alliances. And this is very much a first in Turkish current contemporary history, and I think this was used as an advantage to benefit the AKP government, because what it showed was the recent referendum in 2017, which wasn't an overwhelming success for Erdogan. It was just over 51% of the yes vote to change the system change. So I guess the AKP realized that without an alliance by, I guess, the Nationalist Action Party, they won't be able to get over the 50 plus 1% majority that they needed to have the capture, I guess, to control the parliamentary assembly. So this, I guess, this legislation was made to ensure that. But in return, what the opposition saw was that this is an opportunity for them to also create an opposition bloc, a formal opposition electoral bloc, to contest against this, against Erdogan's hegemony, really. And I think we can really look back at the presidential referendum in 2017, where Meral Akşener, and I'll get to the E Party, was a very newly established centre-right and nationalist party, really outlines how the referendum sparked the opposition into action or collective action. So she says that during the constitutional referendum, Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi, which is the People's Republican Party, the main opposition in Turkey, us as the E Party, Saadet Party, Democrat Party, all took a clear stand against the presidential system. It was a regime change that would ultimately lead to a tek adam regime, so a single man regime, a one-party state. Personally, I believe the system change has been detrimental for Turkey. This is why we have formed this alliance to fight to bring back to democracy. So we can see that this 2017 was very much could be seen as a catalyst moment for the opposition to start looking at new ways to be able to contest this new operating system where they're obviously severely disadvantaged. And what we see in the 2018 elections is these four opposition parties unite. And we see the Republican People's Party, which is centre-left, the E Party, which was at this point a very new party, which stemmed from the Nationalist Action Party, so the right-wing party in Turkey. Saadet Partisi, which is traditionally has always been an Islamist, or we might call a conservative religious party, and Democrat Partisi, which is, I guess, your centre-right party. Really create this formal alliance amongst themselves to contest against the AKP MHP alliance, so this dominant alliance. And I think this is where we need to see that these legislative policies by the government, the AKP government, to advantage itself was actually turned to advantage the opposition. So the opposition really took advantage of this. We saw, I guess, immediately this central alliance, so the Nation Alliance, Millet İttifakı, their central platform was to take Turkey back to democracy. So they really framed this into about democracy or return to democracy versus authoritarian single man rule. And they came out with a joint declaration, or a manifesto, if you want to call it, that promised this return to an improved parliamentary system, protection of basic rights, judicial independence, media freedom. So they really emphasized Turkey's, I guess, authoritarian reality. And they used every opportunity to attack the presidential system, to delegitimize it. And they constantly, basically attacked Erdogan's rule as being, not beneficial or to the detriment of Turkey itself. So they really highlighted this as a political and economic failure. And I think Kılıçdaroğlu, the head of the CHP, if we can sort of go back, that's him there. His quote here emphasized this as well. So we as different political parties are coming together as a show of democratic strength and unity. This is a first in Turkey. As diverse political parties, we have come together to strengthen democracy, to strengthen human rights, to solve outstanding problems through a democratic parliamentary system. This is very important to us. So again, you can see they really, created this dichotomy between, vote for democracy or a vote for authoritarian rule, as in terms of if you're voting for the AKP MHP alliance. At the same time, the presidential elections were held, and we know Erdogan was the key or the main joint candidate under his alliance, whereas these parliamentary electoral alliance, these parties offered their own presidential candidates. So Muharrem İnce is a really well-known CHP politician, was nominated as CHP's own presidential candidate. Temel Karamollaoğlu, which was Saadet Parti's own candidate, and Meral Akşener stepped up as İYİ Parti's candidate. So you can see, and I'll get to Selahattin Demirtas later, and I think Ian as well will discuss upon Selahattin Demirtas, or the HDP, the Pro-Kurdish Rights Party. So you can see, even though they had a joint electoral parliamentary alliance, but they chose different figures for the presidential election. Nonetheless, all these figures, presidential candidates, all worked off the same platform. They did not engage in criticizing each other. They pretty much and worked off the same pro-democratic platform. And they chose to, I guess, as Inge said, that they would actually support one another if the presidential elections were to a runoff. So as he says, in the event I'm not in the second round of voting, that does not matter. I will again get back on top of the car and support the other candidate against Erdogan. It doesn't matter if it is Sayın Karamollaoğlu or Sayın Akşener. We must work together to change the polarization and zero-sum nature of politics in Turkey. It only drags the country into a swamp. But I also expect the same from them in the event I am left in the second round against Erdogan. And likelihood, yes, the others in interviews, Akşener and Karamollaoğlu made the same, I guess, declarations as well, that they would support one another in the event that there was a runoff vote against Erdogan. So you could see, yes, they all in these two concurrent elections, that they all worked together to attack, I guess, to oppose Erdogan and somehow, I guess, throw him out of office through conventional or electoral means. This, I guess, the other important thing we need to understand is the alliances allowed these smaller parties, which wouldn't have been able to get over the 10% electoral threshold, which is probably one of the most, I guess, undemocratic thresholds internationally in Turkey that exists, allowed these smaller parties under these alliance banners to enter the parliament. So again, increase the pluralism or in representation in Turkey. So I think this is another key small aspect that also got overlooked. Again, Karamollaoğlu, Saadet Partisi, he actually emphasizes today's political conditions necessitate this alliance. It removes a 10% threshold. This allows people to vote for parties that they would not have because of the belief that the party would not have gotten over the threshold. Again, this is a really important strategy that the AKP instituted for themselves, but it was actually used, manipulated for the opposition's benefit as well in their strategy. I think when we look at 2018 results, indeed it was a loss. The presidential elections were lost. Erdogan again maintained his power, and the alliance, the AKP alliance, came out on top. But I think given the circumstances, given that these elections were undertaken in state of emergency, given the overwhelming powers and the unlevel playing field that the opposition had to campaign under. And I think the EU observers actually noted this as, if anyone's interested, as a document, how they have recorded how unfair and biased this and how undemocratic in certain ways this election was. You can see there is we can still draw out positives from this, where İYİ Party, which was only instituted not long before, created not long before these elections, had the 10% of the votes to enter parliament. Saadet and Democrat Partisi, both minor parties, were able to attain 3 parliamentary seats collectively through the alliance. And the HDP, which is a pro-Kurdish party, maintained its parliamentary position as well. So we could, I think these are really important things to take away, given that the obstacles, the severe obstacles in the authoritarian operating structure they had to exist or campaign under. I think Ince's rally is a really important point where Ince as a personality really galvanized the CHP supporter base, where this is Izmir, which is normally the heartland of CHP support in Turkish politics. But, nonetheless, we're 2 million attendants at Izmir, and, and very much a busy schedule in his across Turkey as well, where we see 107 rallies in 75 cities in the campaign period. So I think a lot of these key figures were extremely busy with their grassroots politics as well. Meral Akşener is the same thing. We see also in 2019, when we continue on to 2019 elections, we see the continuity of this alliance where CHP and İYİ Party, I guess, came to an agreement to field joint candidates and in, I guess, 22 metropolitan cities and 27 provinces, including the major cities of Istanbul, Ankara, Antalya, Adana, which these cities make up the bulk of Turkey's economic heartland. And AKP-MHP continued their sort of alliance by fielding joint candidates in and supporting each other in 51 cities. So again, you see this continuity from the 2018 elections to 2019 elections, where these main alliances continued. I think this is where the opposition made, I guess, in recent memory under AKP, since AKP's rule, 2002, made its most, I guess, successful gains, where it was able to pretty much, the CHP alliance candidates, joint candidates, were able to win the key cities of Istanbul and Ankara. And Istanbul is the economic heartland of Turkey and has always been the vital sort of key to the patronage politics of the AKP. And been under the sort of Islamist party rule since in 25 years, for 25 years in Istanbul and Ankara. So it was, I guess, a very overwhelmingly strong sort of successful strategy that we see. And I think Ian will get to reasons for that in the next few slides. What we also see, I guess, one of the key aspects of where this worked was that there was this what we might call the bridge, the Turkish-Kurdish electoral cleavage that always existed in the Turkey's highly party politics entrenched in identity politics. The overtures that were made to the Kurdish electorate in the 2018 elections, especially by Muharrem İnce, Ian will discuss that in the next slide or two, really seemed to create this watershed moment between these I guess what you call Turkish identity parties and pro-Kurdish parties as well. And where the HDP declared that they would not nominate candidates for these key cities of Istanbul, Izmir, and Adana. And I think Istanbul is a really important case because what is known that is statistically more Kurds live in Istanbul is the largest Kurdish city in Turkey. So there are more Kurds or Kurdish ethnic peoples living in Istanbul now than there is in southeast or east of Turkey. So this is an important thing that HDP thought would be valuable by not nominating candidates, their own candidate in Istanbul in particular, to not take away votes from the other opposition candidates. So to be able to unite behind one single opposition candidate. It actually called on supporters to vote for Democratic candidates running against the government. And these Democratic candidates, I guess what they alluded to were the CHP candidate of Ekrem İmamoğlu. And even it's the imprisoned former co-leader Selahattin Demirtas called from his prison, called for the HDP electoral base to cast a vote against fascism and create an opportunity for democracy and peace to arrive. So at this phase, it was very much nuanced. It wasn't direct support, not to put any of their core support base offside, but really alluding to, like, you should vote for the İYİ Party CHP candidates. And when Ekrem İmamoğlu, I guess his first victory won Istanbul, and then it was, I guess, unfairly or unjustly taken away, and it went to a rerun, the HDP made much more of a direct emphasis on voting for Ekrem İmamoğlu as the opposition candidate. It actually offered free transportation back to Istanbul for residents who were holidaying outside the city. the party also gathered 15,000 supporters and affiliated lawyers to monitor voting process and ballot boxes. So there was not some sort of, I guess, foul play by the authorities. And Demirtas this time around made more explicit tweet in support of it for the vote to go to Imamoglu. So, a handful of days before, where he actually said, "For today, we believe Ekrem İmamoğlu's discourse should be supported because we are beautiful together." Again, this democratic authoritarian cleavage, though, playing into that, and very much on the democratic cleavage side. And we see that, Ekrem İmamoğlu's support increased amongst the HDP electorate in Istanbul, where statistics show that up to 80% of the HDP support base in Istanbul voted for Ekrem İmamoğlu in the Istanbul region, just showing just how important the HDP was, but how important the initial overtures to the Kurdish electorate and the HDP were in the early 2018 elections in particular. So really watershed moment, I believe, in bridging that cleavage. I think, and I guess leave it up to Ian at this point.
Thanks, Tez. So look, we've only got about a minute or two to kind of cover this stuff, so I'll go quite quickly. So look, we can obviously cover this a little bit more in the discussion and then of course in the question and answers. But, what we see, as Tez covered rightly, we see the formal mechanisms of kind of what's been happening in terms of the Turkish opposition. This, growing and creeping authoritarianism has obviously eroded these democratic foundations. The institutional space is getting smaller. So the opposition's engaged in a lot more kind of informal mechanisms now as we've seen it go on. And what we see particularly is we've seen the kind of continuing tradition of protests and grassroots social movements engaging in this. We've seen the main opposition party, the CHP, engage in what is a justice march, which saw a large number of opposition figures march from Ankara to Istanbul to contest against what they see as an injustice of a system that is highly politicized in terms of the justice system. And then what we see, of course, is the İnce İmamoğlu continuum. I'm happy to expand on this later on in the questions, but we're seeing that the opposition parties are actually looking at more candidates who are appeal to a larger base, not just their Republican credentials, but looking at candidates coming from the Black Sea region who come from a more conservative background, are very pious. İnce obviously was a very pious individual, very enigmatic person, but then of course we see it moving on when we look at İmamoğlu, and he's a lot more humble, much more conservative, his name actually means son of a preacher, so son of an imam. So we have this as well. Tez, do you want to skip through the evolved quickly? Sure. Just the next one, please, mate. Great. So look, just to finish up, we can obviously talk about what's happening in the questions. But one of the key things of our kind of seeing and looking from this contentious politics view is looking at how the strategies have evolved. What have they learnt? This dynamism and activism that happens in the Turkish opposition. And fundamentally what we see is the opposition takes on these evolved strategies, is what we like to call them, or learned strategies, to combat in places that are not traditionally the areas of oppositional politics. So one area particularly that the opposition has been very successful at is combating the AKP's policies towards the economic crisis. There's a large economic crisis in Turkey at the moment, given kind of the large patrimonialism that's going on there and cronyism. The Syrian refugee issue has obviously been a big one since 2015, where the opposition has really combated this. We've seen İmamoğlu, Akşener, and Mansur Yavaş, who's the Ankara mayor, crossing identity politics, moving beyond these kind of ossifications of identity, and this polarization of Turkish identity, which is very prominent in Turkish political discourse. And then finally, we kind of come to this politics of radical love. And this is a strategy that has been very successful in the municipal elections for İmamoğlu, which is, of course, a break from this kind of machismo culture and street fighting political culture, a conscious effort not to attack Erdogan and the AKP. And it's about kind of bridging divides. And, this strategy has kind of been argued to be a possibility of combating populist rhetoric and populism throughout not just Turkey, but throughout the region. And İmamoğlu particularly, it's an antidote to politics of polarization. It's problem-focused policies. It's real politics. It's about human engagement and moving beyond the kind of the bluster and rhetoric that we see from the AKP and of course with Recep Tayyip Erdogan as well.
All right, well, I guess just to sum it up, I think what we're seeing new developments is a continuity of these alliances where former AKP elites Ali Babacan, who was, I guess, the economic czar of the AKP policies in the heyday when Turkish economy was flourishing, but also Ahmet Davutoglu, the former foreign minister and also prime minister. And they've sort of left or resigned from the AKP and created their own respective parties. And now, I guess, seem to be falling into this nation alliance sphere as well, where we see Kılıçdaroğlu have Kılıçdaroğlu and Akşener from the İYİ Party, have had joint meetings or joint statements with these new figures or new opposition parties as well. So nothing's been formalized, but yet these constant joint, I guess, meetings and appearances, and really speaking from the same platform and trying to attacking the presidential system for its failures or failing Turkey is we can see it's increasing or still maintains this opposition alliance. And I think I'll just leave it there. Yeah. And I guess we can discuss this. Sorry, guys.
Absolutely. No, look, this has given us enormous food for thought. And, you're talking about the agency of opposition groups and the way that they've been pushing back against Tek Adam. And, what you've shown us here is this dynamic, mobile, evolving role of the opposition. So thank you very much for that. What we're going to turn to now is our two discussants. So if I can get Dr. William Gurley and Dr. Dara Conduit to put on their videos. They're going to deepen our understanding a bit, both in the Turkish context and comparing to other countries. So can I kick off with you, William?
Okay, thanks very much, Melissa. And thanks, Tez and Ian. That was very, very detailed and very informative. So you've raised lots of ideas and thoughts. But one thing I noticed was your discussion of contentious politics as focusing on political transformation, but sometimes an issue within an authoritarian system where power is concentrated, it's about political participation. An authoritarian system likes to retain power within its own circles or its own cronies or its own cabal of elites, etc., which cuts off political avenues for the broader populace. So an important aspect of maintaining pluralism is obviously allowing everybody, even if they're outside the tent of the ruling clique or the authoritarian leader, still allowing them a means of participation. And so that's where the example of Kurdish politics becomes quite potent, because throughout Kurdish focused parties first arose in the 1990s, but they were never able to specifically say that they were representing only the Kurdish vote, because within the Turkish system, there is no parties are able to identify with a specific ethnicity, even though clearly Turkish nationalist parties are very pro-Turkish. So the Kurdish political movement had to sort of be adaptable from the outset, and during the 1990s, they broadened their demands from demands for Kurdish rights, whether it's language rights or whatever, and they broadened their discourse to say, well, we're targeting or we're aiming for broader democracy, because even prior to the AKP era, Turkey was sometimes classified as an illiberal regime, as in power was restricted and participation was restricted, and so the HDP is the current Kurdish focused party is the main instigator of that. But this is a sort of tradition that has been carried by Kurdish politicians for some time to try and broaden their appeal beyond just the Kurdish electorate, and in so doing attract a broader voters constituency, but also maintain this discourse that they are aiming for broader democracy. And that's very much what's still happening with the HDP today. Having said that, I think a key element of the HDP's appeal and platform at the moment, again, ties into this idea of pluralism, and it's related to my earlier point, is that they're saying that they are aiming to engage the others within the Turkish system. So those are the people who are targeted or classified as other by the AKP, which, as Tez and Ian have touched on, have very much focused on much more of a Turkish nationalist message. So the other minorities within Turkey, being the Armenians, the Syriacs, the Jews, the Greeks, etc., etc., the HDP has made a big effort to engage those constituencies with its multilingual campaigning materials. In fact, Abdullah Demirbaş, who was the mayor of Diyarbakir during the 1990s, undertook language classes in other languages because he said Turkey, or Diyarbakir in particular, needed to recognize its multi-ethnic heritage. So he used to talk about having the Çok Dilli Belediye, which is the multilingual municipality. So in that sense, the HDP is, again, avoiding this being pigeonholed as a Kurdish party, but aiming to broaden its base. So that's a sort of very important aspect of its approach. By the same token, there's probably limited appeal there because the minorities, the Kurds, I mean, numbers of minorities are contentious within Turkey, but the Kurds at most comprise 20% of the vote. The Armenian vote is tiny, the Syrian vote is even smaller. So it's not as if they can suddenly create this wonderful rainbow, multinational, multi-ethnic coalition, which is going to zoom into power. But that is certainly one aspect of their platform. And so, again, it's a form of pluralism, which, the pluralism which Tez and Ian have been discussing is engagement across political divides. But a key element of the HDP's pluralism is aiming for multi-ethnic divide, crossing the multi-ethnic divide. And indeed, they have, I think they had the first Christian parliamentarian, Erol Dora, who I can't remember where he was from, but he was a Syriac, Christian. He was elected to parliament during, I can't remember exactly when, and Garo Paylan, who is a very prominent member of the Armenian community in Istanbul, is a key HDP member. Just on the note about the Istanbul and the Kurdish population, I'd like to qualify that it's not the largest Kurdish city in Turkey. It is in fact the largest Kurdish city in the world. So there is no city, even within the Kurdish regions of Turkey, Syria, Iran, or Iraq, that has more Kurds. Having said that, censuses are highly contentious, and no one knows exactly how many Kurds there are in any of these places. But it's certainly, Istanbul is a very important city for the Kurds, and as Tez and Ian have demonstrated, through these clever, could we call it a democratic dance that the opposition parties have undertaken, Kurds have swung behind the opposition candidates rather than plumping for the AKP. And to a large degree, that comes down to the AKP and the alliance that it has with the MHP, which is a very hardline nationalist party. They're voting against a hardline Turkish nationalist message. And I guess before I finish up, a really important point here is, all these measures are well and good, but the authoritarian regimes are great at dividing the population. That's how they remain in power. There's us, we are the real, true citizens of the nation state, and there's the others, and they are a threat. So a key element of Erdogan's discourse and Bahçeli from the MHP party is trying to cast the HDP with this terrorist brush, noting an affiliation with the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. I'm sure most people are aware of them. So in that sense, there's still some tools there that the authoritarian regime can use, and they can say, well, the HDP, they're affiliated with terrorists, so you shouldn't vote for them. And that is a very potent message. Terrorism is a potent message anywhere. It has a real resonance in large portions of the Turkish population, I would say. And that's also a reason that the HDP, much as it would like, I imagine, to be part of the Nation Alliance, it's never been invited in by the CHP or Actionaire, et cetera, because should that happen, then Erdogan can turn around and say, well, look, they're affiliated with terrorists as well. They're all terrorists, and that's going to completely undermine their alliance. So while they have this strength, there's still some, there's still some tools that are very potent for Erdogan to manipulate. So the situation, there's some upsides, but there's always downsides. So I might leave it there. There's much more that we could talk about, but
Absolutely. Well, and I hope people are thinking about what more we want to talk about and putting it in the Q&A. So please, if anything that is said so far has piqued your interest, you want to know more, or you just want to react, please put it in the Q&A, and very soon we'll be able to open to questions. So can I now turn to Dara? I think you're going to give us some comparisons of that, you know, what does this look like in other situations? Thank you. Dara, you're on mute still at the moment.
Good stuff.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And thank you so much to Taz and Ian for sharing this really, really wonderful research, and also for inviting me to respond to it. I think this is really, really important work. And that's not only because it highlights the ways that vibrant political communities continue to exist in countries such as Turkey and are pushing back against authoritarian regimes and innovating to make their own spaces. But it's also really important because it gives hope, and hope is something that we are lacking, particularly in 2020, but we've also been lacking over recent decades. You know, every year Freedom House releases its Freedom in the World Index. And this year, the index noted that the world has witnessed its 14th year of declining freedom in the world. So while authoritarian regimes are getting stronger and stronger, democracies are backsliding. So I think it's really important that you've made this decision to focus on these groups and these individuals who are working so hard to buck that trend. I probably disagree with your argument that much of what you've identified is unique to Turkey, because I think what you're saying is a pattern that we see in authoritarian regimes all over the world. I mean, obviously all case studies are a little bit different, but there are so many important parallels that you've identified that I think are really rich. And that's why the work that you're doing is so important, because granular case studies like this can draw out these rich insights that can help us understand other places. So thank you so much for doing that. I obviously don't work on Turkey, but I work on Syria and Iran. And I mean, so much of what you were talking about just echoed what I've observed in Iran for so long. You know, Iran has for a long time tried to quell opposition, but the opposition innovates nonstop. It's never stopped innovating, and it responds to every move by the government, and it morphs itself to fit into that opportunity. And I mean, this can be in really enormous ways, but it can also be in little ways. So for example, in the November protests last year, the regime cut off social media apps such as Telegram, so that protesters could no longer organize how to meet, and could no longer find out where the next protest would be located. So protesters began using the Waze app, which is a GPS, navigation app that you could look on there and you could see where the roadblocks were and where the protest locations were, and that Iranians could then head to those locations. So this, we can see, in other contexts as well, this constant sort of cat and mouse, that the regime opens something slightly and the opposition responds, or the regime closes something slightly and the opposition again innovates to get past it. And this is a long-term pattern. Entities such as the Reform Movement have been responding and innovating over decades to this kind of thing. But we also see, this is, and you noted in your paper, this is a symbiotic relationship. So it's not just regimes that, it's not just oppositions that evolve, but it's also regimes that evolve. And the regimes too become more sophisticated based on what they learn from their oppositions and what oppositions are doing. So there's no move by either party that either goes unanswered. So while Taz and Ian are talking about how opposition has responded to this small shift in opportunities in Turkey, I think we probably can expect a counter response too. And I think it will be quite interesting to see how Erdogan responds to this in the next shift and how the next pattern emerges. But I think one of the clearest lessons of this stuff over the past few years has been understanding how this sort of pluralism actually serves authoritarian regimes. So in other countries that I work on, for example, in Syria, there's very little space for opposition, as you see in states such as Turkey or Iran. But in sophisticated authoritarian regimes like Turkey and Iran, or hybrid regimes, as we often call them, there is this opposition trend, and it's become central to the survival of these autocrats. So even though leaders such as Erdogan rule with an iron fist, they can't do so without some level of support. And even Erdogan has that. But another way that autocrats can shore up support and strengthen themselves is by allowing this tiny little bit of opposition to exist. It's not an opposition that will genuinely threaten the regimes, But it's an opposition that can act as a pressure valve to release frustrations. It can channel those with opposition ambitions or who are critical of the regime to use that energy to work in opposition. And it can also incentivize some people to stay within the realm of the system, to sort of play the rules of the game, because they decide that ultimately, maybe if I do participate, I know this opposition can't, you know, I'm not going to win, or I'm not going to achieve that much, but it's better than doing nothing. And so it keeps people who might otherwise be critical or threatening to the regime on the inside. And we can see regimes around the world doing this sort of thing. I wrote about this in a recent paper where I looked at why Iran allows pre-election polling to exist in such a vibrant way ahead of elections. Why would they allow this when the elections are unlikely to be legitimate and polling might actually increase the profile of their opponents? And there's an increasing emerging literature that Lee Morgenbesser at Griffith is working on at the moment, looking at the use of third-party electoral observers in Central Asia. Why would you bring in electoral observers to observe sham elections? Why is there such a huge effort to make these elections look legitimate? And Ian and Tez too spoke about the performative aspect of these things in Turkey. So I guess my closing remark would be to ask, how is it that these oppositions, who I have no doubt are for the most part genuine, but does their presence and recent wins weaken Erdogan, or does it make the regime ultimately more sustainable? That's what I'm wondering.
And that's a scary question to ask, absolutely. So I'll get everyone to turn their video back on for our discussion. The good news is we have about 10 minutes for discussion. And so for people who've been listening and thinking, now is the time to put your thoughts in the question and answer so that we can have a good discussion. We're lucky that we've got our opening one from the director of the Asia Institute, Vedi Hatiz. His question is, if power has been centralised so much on the person of Erdogan, the consequence should be detrimental to the AKP as a party. Is there a post-Erdogan future for the AKP? I ask, given that the AKP does have an established political machinery and patronage networks bringing together business and sections of civil society within the party. Are these all dependent on Erdogan?
I can't turn my camera on for some reason.
Does that work for you? Let's see if that helps. Brilliant. Thank you. We can see you now.
Ian, did you want to?
You jump ahead, Tez. I'll follow you afterwards.
So sorry, I was meddling with my camera. I sort of missed the question.
It's there on the Q&A if you want to open that up. That might be easy. And Ian, do you want to say a little bit to start, and then Tez will join?
So this is obviously, as academics, we're not crystal ball gazers. We don't try to make speculation, but no, Vedi's question is pretty apt. The AKP has built a very large machinery around Erdogan as a political figure. He is a very dominant figure in this. Currently, there is no real discussion or real kind of succession of what would happen once Erdogan loses power. In terms of it as a party, personally, I think without Erdogan, because of the way Turkish political systems and political parties are very authoritarian in their way they're made up, I'm sure Tez can expand on this a little bit, that, you know, perhaps the AKP as a party will no longer exist, but that machinery will probably move and shift to probably another figure within the AKP. So it may not exist as the AKP still, but there may be current kind of leaders within that or factions within that who are now contesting for power once the possibility Erdogan leaves office or, you know, passes away.
I think, yeah, it's a really nice question, Betty. Look, given the history of Turkish politics, it's always been leader-centric. We know that once the leader leaves power or leaves his party, that party pretty much after a short time disintegrates. And given over the, since 2011, perhaps if we could look back to that personalization of the AKP and the very much slow or fast, purging of, key figures or key names, that now the AKP is Erdogan's and in line with that, pretty much the government as well, that I can't foresee the AKP surviving at this electoral level. So, getting the 30-40%, what statistics still show, that it would last that long, because the AKP, his electoral support is built on his charisma. this strong man type leader. He knows how to speak the language of the people, the populism, the conservative values. So once that goes, I don't think anyone there is in that party could ever capture that support into that level of support. And not even if Abdullah Gül remained in AKP, could he have maintained that level of support for more than a couple of years. So I think, yeah, I don't see AKP lasting at these levels if, you know, Erdogan was to, to leave or pass away or got ill. It was just not there.
Well, can I ask you to respond a bit to the question that Dara finished with, which is, can you see that, the opposition might have made Erdogan stronger, particularly if he relies on charisma and all the rest? Is there a chance that any of these tactics have actually strengthened the regime?
I think I agree with Dara in the sense that, with the opposition, like in all these other case studies, that once opposition gains a little bit of success, the authoritarian government learns from it and tries to come about how to sort of stop those successes. I think one thing we need to understand, like Ian pointed out at the start, was that Turkey has, around 70 years of multi-party politics. So that multi-party politics is entrenched within Turkish psyche. And parties like the CHP, which is, were the founding party of the state, so under one state, one party rule, have a long history and a long support base that oscillates between 23-25% of Turkish electorate. So I think Erdogan has reached his peak in terms of, he can of course do little things unless he wants to go full transition to autocratic or despotic system where, he just basically erases all political opposition. But I don't think he has the clout to be able to do that, or the pushback that he might get internationally if he was to go down that full authoritarian line. So he needs to allow for some sort of space. Of course, the next election is up 2023, and I'm sure Erdogan's going to try everything legislatively, try minimizing those efforts because of the opposition, because we're seeing this very much in the municipal, after municipal elections, where they've done pass-through legislation which has slowly eroded the power of the mayors, so of İmamoğlu or Mansur Yavaş in Ankara. So they've used this their legislative authority to undermine the gains of the opposition in the municipal elections. So definitely, I think you're going to see these little tit for tat things, but I guess to really completely remove the threat of the opposition, you would really need to remove, I guess, the political parties altogether to go that far. But I don't think he will.
If I can just jump on board there. I agree with some of the elements that Dara has presented. On other ones, I respectfully disagree. I think, that I'm not talking about Turkish exceptionalism here because, that is part of the discourse, the AKP particularly. But, we have to understand that, as Tez pointed out, Erdogan's levels of support and the way that there is institutional hegemony is a little bit different than regimes that we see in other places in the Middle East. We see something like in Iran, which is very, has a history of more than 40 years of continually evolving and challenging against any social movement or any kind of contestation against its authority. AKP really is a kind of a neophyte in its authoritarian ways of consolidating power, and it's quite brash in the way that it's done it, but it always meets these rail guards. And I think what our research was trying to say is that, we look at, for a long time people said, oh look, opposition is dead in Turkey, it's just really helping Erdogan, no one cares about it, it's all about Erdogan. But we can see from the 2019 municipal elections that the opposition is actually moving into these other strategies. And what that means is that there is a dynamism, there is an activism, it is reaching about 50% of the population, that is anti-AKP, anti-Erdogan.
And this has been since, pretty much, 2002 is always, there's a threshold that AKP has never been able to reach, which is 50%.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why we can see that this full consolidation of authoritarianism is not the same as other kind of Middle Eastern countries, because the AKP, if it was to do it, would need to repress a lot, and use all machinations of the state to do so. Anyway, I think.
Sure. Well, we have one last question I would like to go to it. So I love it when people put questions in. So we have a question from Tarek. He's asking about zero-sum mentality and whether the opposition's current creative strategies to combat authoritarianism might lead to a durable shift away from zero-sum mentality in Turkish political culture in decades to come. And we might use that for everyone, just as a way to say a few last words. So, Ted, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think definitely. We saw this in 2018 elections where the alliance and the presidential candidates stemming from the alliance, Nation Alliance, made concerted effort to move beyond the very polarized politics and appeal across the divide. And then what we saw with Ekrem İmamoğlu and the politics, radical politics of love in the 2019 municipal elections is an evolution of that, where they said, okay, there's this very antagonistic politics, identity politics that we all stem from, or we sort of use as a strategy. Let's put that aside. Let's look for something that is going to bridge that divide, because we know that our core base isn't going to go beyond 20, 25% or 30%, whatever it is. We need to sort of build bridges to appeal to non-traditional voters. And this is where the radical politics of love came in, which we saw was a success in these key elections. Yeah. So and hopefully if this continues, I think I would say to Tarek, if there is somewhere in the future that the opposition parties gain power, I think initially we're going to see this very positive sort of politics survive. What comes maybe after that, I don't know. Like Ian said, I'm not going to look into crystal ball, but I think initially we'll survive this goodwill. I don't know, William, if you know.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say, Ian, a sentence from you, and then I'll do the same for William and Dara.
Yeah, look, I think the zero-sum mentality and moving away from this is something that, and Turkey provides a good example, this is moving away from this populist authoritarian polarization. And I think that kind of strategy of trying to reach across the divide, trying to engage in political discourse that is not just about identity politics, that is not about presenting the other, is possibly the way forward. A bit idealistic, as we say, but I think it's a positive way forward. And look, the radical love agenda could be a framework for other countries, like in Hungary, for example, or in Poland, these kind of hybrid competitive authoritarian regimes where you have these kind of increased polarization and increased use of very kind of inflammatory language. So, this is obviously a very way of shifting that. So
thank you very much, Ian. William?
Goodness me, where to start?
It's just one sentence.
I think it's really positive, all this building bridges and making connections. And, it's sort of heartwarming and seems, reason for hope. How long it lasts is another thing entirely. I mean, if we take Iran as an example as well, if we go back to 1978, the revolution wasn't just the Islamists. There was all sorts of groups who rose up to throw out the Shah because they hated the Shah. Yeah. There was students, there was leftists, there was unionists, there was communists, there was the Islamists. And once the bogeyman was gone, they divided again. So not that I'm wanting to put the moz on Turkey. Who knows whether those sort of bridges will be maintained once Erdogan goes, and he'll go eventually through some means. One
There's
other
always
point I wanted to make earlier.
That's more than one sentence.
Okay. All right. We'll have to have another session.
I think we should. So, Dara, one last one for you.
Well, I guess my, my main areas where I work are Syria and Iran. So I don't feel quite so optimistic, but I do hope that Tez and Ian are correct.
Yeah. Well, look, again, thank you so much. We could have gone another 10 minutes without any question. This has been an absolutely fascinating topic. And I think it's a real example of the work we do at the University of Melbourne here in the Asia Institute, and how this should be taken to a wider audience. I found it, as someone who doesn't know that much about Turkey, I found this absolutely fascinating, and I've enjoyed every second. If you're left wanting more, please do go to the Melbourne Asia Review page, where you can find the full article by Tez and Ian, and you can read more there. This will be the last of our webinars from my side, from the Asia Institute for the year. We'll be looking at the work of some of the other clusters when we come back in 2021. So if I can say again, thank you, Tez, thank you, Ian, thank you, William, thank you, Darren, thank you, Matt, for all the work of the Islam and Politics cluster. It's been a pleasure to have everyone here today.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for participating.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Melissa. William, we'll talk later.
Absolutely.